Thank you very much, everybody, for coming to this fourth Lunch and Learn webinar. We do these every month, and I'll promote the date for the next one because we will be skipping August for holiday reasons. But thank you for coming, and we're really looking forward to a good discussion today. We are recording for the benefit of people that can't come to the live event, and we will be publishing this onto our YouTube channel. So if anybody's concerned about being on camera or saying something they don't want recorded, please think about that before you put your name forward or put your hand up. Without further ado, just a quick one. Normally at this point I introduce my guest speaker. We thought for this particular review of the Grenfell Uncovered documentary, we would turn that over to you guys as the audience to contribute far more than you would normally in one of these short sessions. So I'll run through in a moment sort of how we think we're going to structure doing this. We've never done one of these like this before, so please bear with. But a little bit about me for those that haven't been to one of these events before. So I'm Matt Hodges-Long, CEO and founder of the Building Safety Register and Track My Risks. Between those organisations, we do primarily most of our work is in building safety and the technical sort of information exchange, data management side of that process. And the way that we describe this in terms of what we do as a business, both within the built environment and in other industries, is that we save lives and careers with technology. So really everything that we do is about either saving lives or saving people's careers. Quite often, if you don't save the lives, it doesn't add to your career prospects. So those two things do link. We think a much better way of saying things other than governance, risk and compliance systems or whatever. This is our way of explaining what we do. Why we do it is based on, or how we do it is based on three core values, which we call our chi. So that's commitment, humanity and integrity. So in terms of everything that we put into the marketplace, everything we talk about, the stance we take on issues is driven by those three core values that have been with us since the day we started the company over 11 years ago, that we always benchmark everything we do back to those. And I think sometimes that sort of gives context to some of the things that I might say in public, for example, about what's happened post-Grenfell is entirely related to those three core values that we hold dearly. So again, it might not always be the best thing to do commercially, but we think it's the right thing to do from a human perspective. So that's a little bit about what we do. Before I go on any further, I just want to pause for a minute and say, if we can all think, today is 16 years to the day that the Lakanal House fire tragedy occurred, with the loss of 6 lives in London. And I think it's something that we'll probably touch on as we go through the conversation, and in terms of the bearing that Lakanal had on Grenfell, or should have had on Grenfell, and the way that Lakanal featured in the documentary. So again, just in case anybody had missed it, and it's probably quite easy to miss it, today is the day 16 years ago that dreadful fire took place. The other thing that I just want to talk about is as I was researching the more of the detail ahead of this webinar, one of the things I did was go back and look at some other documentaries and other things that have formed our opinion in terms of building and fire safety. And one of them, I think I just want to play a little clip from, because the more I think about it, really shaped the way I think about building and fire safety, and it was from a very early age, and that is the Towering Inferno from 1974. And I just want to play, and I can't up the volume anymore on this, so please listen. But I just want to play this little clip that I think is absolutely pertinent.
Counts less than 200. You know, one of these days, you're going to kill 10,000 in one of these fire traps. And I'm going to keep eating smoke and bringing out bodies until somebody asks us how to build them.
And I think for anyone that hasn't watched that, please, and I'm sure there's probably nobody in the audience today that hasn't watched it, but if you haven't watched it for years, please go back and look at it, because whether it's the builders not doing their jobs properly, or blocking fire escapes inadvertently, or audacious ways of rescuing people from tall buildings, it's pretty much everything we need is there in that film from 1974. But rolling the clock forward a bit, I just sort of did a little bit of a timeline to remind myself about.
200.
Right. To remind myself of what's already out there, what's already been covered in terms of Grenfell. And the first one, I don't recall watching this at the time, but so 7 or 8 days after the tragedy, Sky News did a 1-hour documentary called The Fire of London. And if you go back and watch this like I did, actually it is not only a time capsule of what people were thinking and doing at that time contemporaneously, but also virtually everything that cropped up in or has been uncovered in the inquiry over the last 6 or 7 years was pretty much covered in that documentary. They talked about the source of the fire, they talked about the cause, they talked about the tenant management organisation, they talked about the surface spread of flame, etc., etc. They pieced all of this together within a few days of the fire. So this has been around for a long time, and it really is both a disturbing but a compelling watch at that time. Now, obviously, quite a few things in terms of the number of victims wasn't known. Lots of things hadn't happened, but you could sort of see where we know we watch it based on knowing what happened afterwards. So you sort of, this is like the lead into the story, but it's unbelievably strong. There's also another few documentaries floating around. So this one by Dark Records, again, I'd never heard of this. 1.9 million views on YouTube. Again, it talks a lot more about the circumstances of why the development was built, what was happening back in the 70s, the construction methods, etc., as well as some of the modern footage from after the fire. So again, that's well worth a watch. And I just found all of these by just Googling Grenfell Tower documentaries on YouTube. And then this Plainly Difficult one again is more sort of almost homemade, but again, you see it's had over 1 million views, talking about other aspects of the fire. So there is actually quite a lot of coverage out there, but nothing on the scale of the Grenfell documentary, the Grenfell Uncovered documentary, which we'll be discussing today. So that's the 20th of June 2025, and I thought when I was sort of putting this together, I was sort of thinking of stories and things to talk about this month, and I thought, well, we can't really look beyond the fact that since our last Lunch and Learn, we've had the 8th anniversary of Grenfell and the launch of the Grenfell Uncovered documentary. So really what I wanted to do is sort of just open up the chat in a second about what we found and what we thought of this. And I hope everybody online today has watched it. If they haven't, hopefully we'll fill in some of the blanks. And if you haven't, then please do watch it afterwards. But just make sure you're in the right space to watch it, because it's pretty impactful. What I'm hoping to do, I went through and thought, well, how do I unpick a 1 hour, 40-minute documentary and try and break it down into some logical components? So again, this may or may not work, but what I wanted to do was sort of say, well, let's look at some of the human stories of people featured in the documentary. Then perhaps look at the experts that took part, and I'm sure a lot of us on the call will know one or more of the expert contributors to the documentary. Number 3, I've painted as the villains. Now, they're not necessarily the villains, but and not meant to be pejorative, but ultimately the people that are named in the report that are discussed in the documentary, perhaps the ones that don't give their side of the story. But they are portrayed as the causes or contributors to the disaster. A quick chat on the technical aspects. There was a couple of things that jumped out at me where I thought, well, that's not quite right technically, but overall, let's talk about that and see if other people may have noticed other things. A chat about the storytelling, and this is where I'm probably straying the furthest out of my lane in terms of competence, but sort of how they narrated the story. My concern when I first heard about it and I wrote about it was that this is such a sensitive topic. I really hope that the producers do the right thing by the community that are impacted and by the survivors. And I think, I'm sort of not letting the cat out of the bag, but I think my view is they did a really good job. But others may differ. And then the green box is around the impact of it. So will this actually change anything? Will we see anything as a result of this documentary, or will it just go onto YouTube in the future like the other ones that I mentioned before that occasionally somebody may stroll across, or will it actually change policy? Will it have a positive outcome? So that was the structure of what I was hoping to do. We have had some questions submitted prior to the event that came out in the email. So what I've done is where one of those questions logically fits into one of those 6 blocks, I've put it in the correct place, and I'll raise it or ask somebody that asked it to come off mute. But a lot of them are more technical, sort of where do we go from here? What's our opinion on this regulation, or whatever kind of questions, or more sort of typical technical questions. So what I'll probably do is park those and do those at the end in a block. So as we go through, I've got a few points to chuck in, but I'm really keen on seeing hands up and opinions and all those sorts of things as we go through those 6 blocks. So we will crack on, because I'm conscious that I think time is going to evaporate quite quickly on this one. So on the human stories, for me, I mean, this was the hardest bit for me, and one that literally gets me every time I sort of think about it or talk about it. But in no particular order, I think Luana Gomes was just amazing, and she was one of the main threads through the documentary. So I think she's 20 now, she's either 20 or 21. She was 12 at the time, and she tells her story that's woven through the documentary as it progresses, her and her father Marcio, and just absolutely incredible how she portrayed that, and but you could quite obviously see the impact that that's had on her life. Another one that's sprung out for me is Dave Badillo, one of the firefighters, and I've sort of exchanged a few messages in the past with Dave. I haven't actually met him personally, but you could just see that pain that was etched on his face all these years on, about what he could have done differently, what he experienced being one of the first firefighters on the scene, how they thought that they were going into a normal fire. They happen all the time, a kitchen fire or whatever. And I think, as he said in the thing, that they thought they'd be done very soon and go back to bed back at the fire station. How wrong he was. I also got the impression that I felt that at that moment, at that time, he was tragically let down by his employer, but not so much on the night, but the lack of preparation, the lack of process that put those initial firefighters in such a terrible position when they arrived. And then the third one I just want to pull out, and it isn't sort of ignoring anybody else, was a guy that's never really mentioned, Bahelu Kebede. So Bahelu Kebede was the chap with the fridge, flat 16, 4th floor, the source of the fire. And I was really pleased that the documentary makers squashed the nonsense that's spoken about that man very early up front and said, look, this is where these rumours came from. They talked about the Daily Mail, etc., etc. And the reality is, electrical equipment bursts into flames when we don't want it to. It happens, etc. It should not have that impact. It should not kill 72 people. It was entirely not his fault. But it just did remind me that the he was to blame narrative came up for me 2 weekends ago with a family member at a barbecue where we discussed the documentary. This person from my family hadn't seen it, but said, well, it's the guy that set light to the place effectively, wasn't it? And then some other conspiracy theories came out, which I had to stop. But it just shows to me we've got to carry on keeping focused on the facts and not looking, as Pete App said, for a simple scapegoat, which I think is what was happening. And that is really, I think, incumbent upon all of us to get the truth out there and just remind people when these conspiracy theories are being spoken about what the actual facts were that were confirmed by the inquiry and the investigation. So I thought I saw a hand up. I mean, Richard, if you could help me with hands, please, in terms of, I can only see a few, but Sue, Dave Badillo really moved me. The firefighters were let down so much by lack of information in so many ways, and his inability to know about flat 175 was a terrible example of that. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The chaos that must have unfolded, and I think from one of my slight criticisms with the documentary was I didn't really think that the firefighters' testimony really sort of hung together with the timeline. Now, I don't know whether that was just because of the confusion of the time, but it was I went to this floor and then I went here, and this was happening. Didn't really. It sort of almost was being a story being told outside of the wider narrative. It's just something that I think. Jamie, the part that broke me in the documentary is the same part that broke me when I read Show Me the Bodies. It's Marcia Gomez and his daughter Luana, trying to escape down the staircase, jet black smoke, and having to climb over. Yes. Yeah, I mean, that was hideous to imagine. And as we sort of have this debate about 1 staircases versus 2, have we bothered testing the AOV system? You know, have there been any CFD modelling for smoke, whatever? Have we got closers on our doors? I think that's the point we need to remember of what happens when that goes wrong. What happens when, whether you've got 1, 2, or 3 staircases, if they're all full of smoke, you might as well not have any. So yeah, that's a really good point, Jamie. Ibrahim, with Ebert Defan, when he described his exchange with the contractor, something along the lines of be grateful getting the service for free, gave me thoughts about procurement. Yeah, absolutely. I did note that I think he was saying that was a Ryden employee. I've got it here. Yeah, you're getting it for nothing. I wouldn't mind if I was getting it for nothing. I think was the quote. Which again, I think is that sort of othering of residents, and I think a lot of people think, well, that's to do with class or it being council housing or whatever, but we're seeing that as well in private blocks. So a lot of people sort of say, well, if this was a block full of, you know, rich city bankers, this wouldn't have happened. I don't actually subscribe to that. I think that could quite possibly happen. I think there were other layers in the Grenfell story, but ultimately there is still a general lack of respect for residents' voice, residents in, you know, the lived experience. Okay, and I'll take the messages, and if anybody wants to come off mute, then put up. But Sue's just said, I was glad the documentary makers pointed out the huge range of types of people, races and classes that live there. Another example of blame culture. Absolutely, absolutely. This was a diverse community, and that community should have been listened to, should have been given the respect that we would give to other communities. And I think they did portray Kensington, I think, in the sense of when they showed the cutaway shot to the tower and then the very, very expensive houses in the foreground, and sort of saying this is one of the most extreme boroughs or, you know, areas of England where of that disparity between rich and poor. But yeah, I agree with Sue. I think that worked really well and was very cleverly done. So unless anyone else has got anything on the human bit, I'll move on to the experts then, because you know, again, in no particular order. So my thought on the expert element was there was enough expert input to sort of illustrate the story, but not to turn it into a sort of a deeply technical scientific expose of building safety or material science or whatever. I think there was enough. Personally, as the audience, I would want a lot more of that stuff, but I have to remind myself that I'm not normal. And I think probably a lot of people on this call in the nicest possible way, I probably know way too much about this in relation to the wider community, which I think was the target audience. So I think on that point, it was good. Guillermo Rain, the fire engineer, academic, I mean, great guy. Don't think I've ever met him in person, but certainly have online. I think the way that he explained what the materials were and how they burn, etc., and the gases they give off, and I think it was really cleverly done using the lab. I slight disappointment, but I don't know how they would have got it in, is they didn't really talk about other types of combustible products used in external walls. So there's always been the narrative I've heard from a lot of people that said, well, we don't have any metal cladding on our building, we're okay. Not necessarily the case. So I think that perhaps could have been more of a discussion a little bit about combustibles more generally, and that it's not just a high-rise building problem. But I can understand in the context of Grenfell why you would focus on ACM. Pete Apps, he was very, I thought, cleverly positioned as the narrator of the story. And he has been pivotal in narrating the overall story, I think, post-Grenfell for most of us. And that was, in a way, I think, a little bit sort of downplayed. I think he's been far more influential in this whole discussion than perhaps he was portrayed in the documentary. But you know, it was cleverly done, and I think again he used language that I think people would understand and would connect. And the most powerful bit for me with him was where he was watching Eric Pickles give evidence to the inquiry, when Eric Pickles talked about, you know, the nameless people and, you know, the 96 people, I think it was, that died or something, probably misquoting him. And then they cut to Pete Apps and he said, you know, that effectively that's typical of somebody that doesn't care. You know, for all of us, 72 is a number that we all recognize. You know, 96 was Hillsborough, but it just shows that they are, you know, effectively people unworthy of consideration in Eric Pickles' view. And we'll come on to talk about Mr. Pickles or Lord Pickles perhaps in the next bit. Jay Leslie has said he's lost sound. Is it just me? Does everybody give me a wave if you can hear? Yeah, it's you, Jay. So yeah, Bex has just said the Eric Pickles statement was shocking. We'll come on to him in a minute when we get to the villains. The Celestine Chong was on there, who at the time was at the Fire Protection Association. She's not somebody I know or have ever really come across in this discussion. So I did some Googling and found that she was more involved in the Lakanal time. And again, throw up if anybody knows. Richard Millett, hard to know how to describe him other than I think he's an absolute legend. And I think his use of words is just unbelievable. The things that jumped out with me, and I used it in one of my posts, the describing Grenfell as the intrusion of universal horror. I thought, what a better way to describe what happened. And on the manufacturers, when he was talking about manufacturers, he said, if all these people are right, the manufacturers, or saying it wasn't me, then no one was to blame, and that is the problem. And I think we can all agree with leading on to the merry-go-round of buck passing and all those sorts of things, that, you know, everyone was pointing at someone else and saying it's not me. And I think, and then Sarah Sjoberg, I think she's pronounced, the lady from Alcoa. Interesting, but I've watched this 4 times now, and I still listen back and think, what was she actually doing in this documentary? What did she add? I think if she'd have been painted as a whistleblower that said, I tried to call this out and tried to stop it, that I would have understood. Or I'm here to defend the record of my previous employer, I could have understood it. But she just talked about Alcoa, and it seemed a bit vague to me. I don't know whether anybody else got that impression from watching it. And then I think that's all I've got on my list, but I don't know whether I've missed anyone else from that experts column. But does anyone have any thoughts on what they took away from the experts? Oh, Jay's raised his hand. Come on, Jay, if you'd like to come off mute. And
right, they should be able to turn your microphones on now.
All right. Sorry, that was
Hello, Matt. How are you?
Very good, Jay. What do you want to say?
Yeah, I think they could have used a broader range of experts. You know, we didn't get to hear from Barbara Lane. We didn't get to hear from perhaps the London Fire Brigade Commissioner. I mean, some of these people may have said they didn't want to speak, but, you know, even if there'd been like a firefighting expert talking about the firefighting tactics that were used and how England has learned to do better as such, but there was none of that to show, if it was to happen again, how we would be better prepared.
Good point. Good point. Yeah, thanks, Jay. Yeah, it's interesting. I've spoken to a couple of people that were approached but declined to get involved. I think maybe coming back to that earlier point that I mentioned about how what was the treatment going to be of residents, and was this going to be some kind of overly dramatized, kind of hideous hit job, if you see what I mean? It wasn't, and I think the a lady Sadiq, the director, I think, has been quoted in one article saying that, you know, this community has been poked and prodded enough. You know, so she's very conscious about that not being the case. But yeah, it's a good point. There were, I suppose, within the time, I think they did give the experts a lot of time, a lot of screen time, which I think if you had more experts, then you would have cut down the amount of time for expert input. So it's an interesting one on execution.
Yeah, I mean, I'm
sorry,
sorry. I was just going to say, I think that could have very easily been a 3 or 4 hour documentary rather than an hour and a half.
Yeah, and I think keeping an audience for that long on this subject, I guess, is a calculation. It was quite long as it was, so hour and a half, hour and 40, or whatever. That's quite a long time for a factual documentary. Sue's mentioned that it would have been better to have Barbara Lane on. Her expert witness report is an exemplar, and she speaks in a very approachable way. Yeah, I mean, yeah, maybe in a in addition to, I mean, we don't know. I haven't asked Barbara whether she was invited or not, but yeah, she does communicate so well. I think she's absolutely brilliant. I've got a lot of time and respect for Barbara, and yeah, maybe there'll be another one. Maybe there'll be a follow-up. Maybe there will be a what happened next. Certainly, I've spoken to Rogan, contacted Rogan Productions, the production company, and said, look, if you can get the budget for it, telling the story of what happened afterwards to everybody else that followed, that are still stuck in the building safety crisis, I think would be really worthy of a follow-up. Yeah, so Abdul, yes, the professional associations were missing. Was there a failure on their part also? Yeah, interestingly quiet on the professional associations. I think there's a few people on this call that would have some views on that, but yeah, Sue wants to put her hand up actually, so yeah, should we call Sue in on that one?
Hello. Yeah, I work in the construction industry. For those of you who don't know me, and just to say that there has been a tendency throughout for manufacturers, trade associations who are basically member associations or manufacturers to keep their heads down and be very quiet. And I think it's surprising that someone from Alcoa was on at all. You know, maybe we're moving from experts into villains, but I think that has been the general answer to the crisis management, is to say nothing, because if you say anything, you've got your head above the parapet, you're stepping away from the mass of the flock of gazelles, if you like, and everyone will come down on you like a ton of bricks. And that's I'm sure the legal advice is the same. So that's I think why they still managed to get Alcoa on. Well, maybe Alcoa, that the woman from Alcoa was far enough removed, or the organisation considered themselves or wanted to remove themselves from their subsidiary. I don't know, but yeah, it's not surprising.
One more hand up, which Jay wants to come back, and then we're going to go on to the villains. I think just keeping.
Yeah, sorry. Thought a very apt time to come on and talk about the article that was written about me at the weekend, because that was obviously all to do with professional associations. But if everybody wants to have a look at that, that's not had a look at it, it's on Substack under the journalist Andy Wong. Matt, are you all right to share a copy of that with everyone?
Yes, I'll just put it in the comments. I'll try and remember to, if one of the team can remember, we'll try and get that out to everybody when we do the follow-up notes. But yeah, I think the professional associations here have certainly played a significant part. Oh, speak of the devil, and Andy Wong is on the call. So Andy's the journalist that wrote the article discussing Jay at the weekend. So just 1 minute, Andy, if you can. So that would be good, and then we'll move on.
Oh, hi. Yes. Afternoon, all. Yes, I'm just dropping in on this call and just listening in and doing my own reading up and research. Thanks, Matt, for the phone call yesterday as well. Thanks, Jay, for your plug out as well. I hope what I read written about you has done you justice in and of itself. And yes, I will. I'm just treat me as a fly on the wall. I'm just here to look and listen and learn because there's a lot of things that I still do not know enough of. And when I know enough about it, maybe I'll write something about it.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Cheers. Right, so moving on to the villains. And again, for any lawyers watching, I am not saying that any of these people are technically villains. They were portrayed as being on the wrong side of the argument in the documentary, and please don't sue me. So in no particular order, I think Eric Pickles, to me, he just conformed to all those sort of ugly stereotypes of politicians of being aloof, uncaring, almost robotic in sort of having absolute lack of empathy for anyone or anything. That's the way that he came across. Now, obviously, he's been edited, but you can only work with what's in the public domain for an edit. You know, he did actually say those things, that he did ask Richard Millett to hurry up and the inquiry to hurry up because he had a busy day. He did, yeah, as Jay said, remember you have me for a finite time, so use your time wisely. And he just came across as being a nasty person. And having worked with a number of, or tried to work with a number of senior civil servants in the Ministry of Housing, and he was there, but I can definitely see those character traits in some of those senior people within the ministry. And I just wonder if that's just a type of person that rises to the top in that kind of organization, because very light on detail, very dismissive about people. And maybe if you'll get to a point of having to make these big decisions, maybe you just become numb to humanity, I guess, and it's just all a game. I don't know, but it didn't come out of this well. And it's hard to get the impression whether he really cares or not. So the next one was, Matt Hancock did I think that was about the COVID inquiry. Yeah, absolutely. I think he had his, you just don't understand how hard it is going to so many lunches. Right, yeah, okay, well, that's just, yes. I think he had his day in the sun taken away from him yesterday with the Chancellor's issues. So, Brian Martin, to choose my words carefully, I think he summed up in that quote about Francis Kirkham, the Lakanal coroner, in his response, that we don't need to kiss her backside. It's just really, I think if anything could sum up what must have been going on in the Ministry of Housing at that time and in the lead up to and probably the years post, that kind of comment in an email was acceptable. That wouldn't be acceptable in my world if somebody that worked with me or for me sent me an email like that in relation to a coroner talking about six avoidable deaths. No way, Jose, but he carried on. And Francis Kirkham, I have had the pleasure of meeting. I think there's a few other people on this call probably that have met Francis over the years, and she's an incredible lady, and I don't know how she copes with her recommendations not being taken forward, and you know how the world could be different if maybe people had listened and done something with her recommendations. We'll probably come back to that in a minute. And then I think when you think, could he have said, show me the bodies to somebody, and he alleges that he didn't say it, as far as I'm aware. I just look at the clip of him addressing the IFE a year after the Grenfell tragedy that's in the documentary, where he's making jokes about his seniors and, you know, time prioritization and being lazy and all those sorts of things to an industry group, probably knowing that he was being recorded. And that makes me think I would absolutely put him in the category where I could believe that he would say something like, show me the bodies. I'm not saying that he did say it, but it wouldn't surprise me. And again, this is somebody I've never met, but I am, from what I've seen and what I've read, I am appalled that he is off now plying a trade, doing expert witness work on fire safety. I just find that incredible. And if I needed an expert witness, I wouldn't have him on my list of people to call. So Abdul, values, ethics, humanity, themes missing, and the role of institutions in these things. Yeah, absolutely. It's when we stop caring, we have these problems, you know. And I always try and think of it, but I do also have to balance that with the fact that the provision of housing is complex, it's difficult. Everybody has a different idea. You've got to get the job done. You may be starved of money or whatever, but I think you can still do that in a way where you don't completely abandon humanity, or you don't employ a bunch of people that couldn't care less. Sue, Brian Martin definitely had the information in front of him. He needs to make different decisions, unlike many other people. Right, so he had the information, right? Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people did. I think when we're talking about villains, I haven't got them definitely on there, but when you look at the Alcoa, I think it was Alcoa, the failure of the test getting an F grade from the fire test and just putting oops after it, you know, without straying into areas where their lawyers might get excited, but, you know, looking at what's in the public domain, you know, having been to that Norwegian conference and, you know, come back and said, look, you know, this could be us effectively, and then nothing happening. I think it's just, we absolutely need that criminal investigation. My gut feel is I think they're going to find it very hard to actually make anything meaningful stick, but I hope I'm wrong. So Ibrahim, I think the director or someone that banned the Grenfell residence blog on the TMO's webpage or something like, can't remember. It was, so I think the guy in the documentary said it had been done, but he ordered the unblocking of so this was for the Grenfell residence blog was blocked on the servers of the Kensington and Chelsea TMO and the council, I believe, so that they couldn't see, the staff couldn't see the comments or the commentary that's being made. But again, I think this is back to rebel residents again, isn't it? And sort of silencing voices, silencing concerns. You know, it's not to say you haven't got to go and make a decision at some point, and you've got to make a policy decision, but just writing people off for the perception or that they don't have the knowledge, you know. And I've been on the receiving end of that professionally fairly recently from a president of one of the large fire associations that making all sorts of accusations about why I shouldn't have a voice on a particular subject. Because of a perceived lack of qualification. So I can only imagine what that's like if you're a council tenant in a tower block in London. English might not be your first language, but you've got genuine concerns. You know, these people do need to be listened to. You know, everybody has a voice. everybody deserves a safe home. So that I completely disagree with. Jay, blocking. Yeah, but I think, Jay, that they could find it. But I think to me, it's the act of blocking something, pretending it doesn't exist. You know, silencing. They're all rebels. I think that was my concern with that. Sue, when someone is dishonest and conceals that dishonesty, everyone else who relies upon them becomes an inadvertent villain too. When you don't have the procedures in place to check for dishonesty, fraud, deliberate omission, this is what happens. Yeah, I think you're right there. There needs to be those lines of defense, but also I think there needs to be a more open culture to whistleblowers. And it's even not a nice term because it's kind of your final act of storming out the door, I think, quite often being a whistleblower, but it being called a whistleblower. But ultimately, people that have a valid point to make, quite often that's backed up with evidence, there should be a way of making sure that's listened to. Even if you turn around and say, look, we've reviewed your evidence and based on X, Y, and Z, we think you're wrong for these reasons, or we're not going to take this forward, but we've considered it. Doesn't mean to say that just because somebody comes up with some feedback or a comment, you've got to take it. But I think it is incumbent upon people to actually listen to that and review and take it seriously. That's not to say there aren't some people out there that might just be completely vexatious and just with an axe to grind or whatever and causing problems and being difficult. But you've got to pick through that and find the fact that I think quite often people get into that position because of being ignored. That's when they become irritating, but deliberately so to try and get people to listen. They won't give up. Yeah, Abdul, key lesson about hearing those voices and how best to do that. Yeah, so I think when we're talking about villains, those people definitely didn't. And I have one more villain, and I really struggle with this one because she is both the villain and slightly not a villain now, in my opinion. And that's Theresa May, who was the Prime Minister at the time. Absolute villain for her lack of leadership immediately afterwards. Not visiting, not engaging, the fact that she could have helped local residents much more greatly. She did promise she was going to set up a victims commission, never didn't. She talked about seeing through inquiry recommendations, didn't happen, still being discussed. But she is slightly offset in my mind by being the only one that appeared on camera to talk about what happened. I was disappointed that she didn't really come across to me as being particularly repentant about what happened, and I may have, again, my view may have been prejudiced watching that. So I don't know whether anybody got a different view. I mean, maybe I'll throw it open. Does anybody want to throw in a comment about, did their opinion of Theresa May change positively or negatively as a result of watching the documentary? There you go. That's the question. Can't see me typing.
I thought negatively, purely because I think the only reason she was edited positively was to get her on camera. And I think she used that to get the positive spin.
So you think she was trying to sort of repair her reputation?
Yeah, and I think Netflix perhaps allowed her to control the narrative because it was more important to get someone on camera that was prepared to talk from government than not. But
Yeah,
perhaps I'm just cynical.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know whether she had a. I mean, ultimately, I guess if you're making a documentary, you know, having never done this and probably never will, if you bid the ex-prime minister that was involved at the time and she says yes, it will probably have some caveats with it. I guess maybe not. It's a shame. The thing I should have mentioned, I did try really hard to get the director of the documentary on, and unfortunately, we nearly got there, but a diary clash got in the way. So she was 20%, 30% going to be appearing today, and I couldn't say anything about it, but unfortunately it didn't work. Because I think that's one I think I would love to know from her how that process happens. So, you know, does securing an ex-prime minister for a documentary come with a rider, if you like, or is it just ask me what you want and do whatever you want with me? I don't know. I don't know whether we have anybody here from the TV production world that could maybe chuck a comment in to answer that. So Neil, I, like others in the construction industry, spent my career learning of the technical elements of what, why, how, and when. Ministerial appointments can't take on the learning we accrue in their relatively and generally short careers. The decision making must be taken on professional opinion. Yet the professionals engaged are seemingly on the periphery of construction, which remains the case with the retirement of Philip White. Our lessons truly learned, one consultation isn't whole. That's a really, really good point, Neil, because take away Philip White, put in Andy Rowe and Charlie Pugsley. I wouldn't want to say what they do or don't know. They've got an organisation to run, but I think ultimately, if you don't have that accumulated knowledge of an industry, I think it must be really hard to jump into it at such a senior level in the middle of a crisis without the context, because then you are relying on those advisors around you, and a significant number of those advisors that are still in post are the advisors that were key to this problem developing in the first place. And then if you go slightly outside of that, you're into the institutions that have been mentioned before, where there is a muscle memory to cover up bad stories, to perhaps not be as stringent with your members as you should be to protect the customer interest. You could call it vested interest, call it whatever you like, but there aren't any new brooms in that marketplace as well. So where do you get your advice from? So what I would recommend for anybody, and I've done exactly this, and is I've reached out to Charlie Pugsley and said, I'd love to have a cup of coffee with you. There's things I think we need to discuss. And he very graciously has said, let me get into position because I've got, my current job, which I need to finish, and we'll arrange time to meet. So I think I'm taking that as a positive sign that perhaps there's a different approach to managing the building safety regulator inbound. Time will tell. So again, that's just on that point, sort of slightly dropping off topic.
There's a hand up from Nikki Barrow.
Oh, Nikki, right, got a hand up.
Whilst I'm not a particular fan of politicians at all, to be honest, I think that actually through watching the documentary, my opinion of Theresa May was actually quite positively impacted, because I thought, well, one, at least you're willing to come and sit down and talk about it. Two, whether it was the way it was edited or what, I don't know, but actually she did answer questions directly, and we do not get that from politicians very often. And three, actually, at least she made admissions that her administration made errors, and that again is not something we see very often from politicians.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's really good, Nikki. I think that's why I sort of said that. I think I'm like you. I overall, I think my opinion of her improved a bit. It's still not great, but it's better than it was, and certainly not on the Eric Pickles scale of numbness or lack of empathy or whatever you would call it. So I think we've probably done I didn't go with the villains into the manufacturers. I think there's I think that's been discussed a lot. I don't think the documentary really added too much to that body of knowledge apart from telling the basic story. I think there were a lot of people that weren't mentioned, a lot of manufacturers that weren't mentioned. They didn't really get into the whole gaming of test results piece. I think it was very much portrayed as this material shouldn't have been on this building, and it burnt, and it led to this outcome. Move on. And I can understand within the time constraints why they did that. So moving on to the technical side of things. Oh, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. The technical side of things. So one bit that jumped out was on some of the point, and I think this is where having Barbara Lane, I think, would have really helped. The way that Stay Put was described, and in relation to that, the way that Pete described compartmentation, where he talked about a 2-hour separation between flats. My concern about that is that it's not the case, and lots of people were watching and probably wanted to understand what was behind Stay Put, and I think they could have done a lot more to explain the assumptions that underlie Stay Put and why there is a risk, and then how that relates now to what we're doing post Grenfell with things like simultaneous evacuation. But you could tell that from what I think it was Ed Defan was saying, his reaction, that Stay Put had been drummed into everybody there, that, you know, oh, it's a fire. My initial reaction is I will stay put, because that's what we've been told repeatedly. So again, I think that was the thing. And then I did mention about the materials, where there was a lot of focus on PE, ACM, but no real mention of other types of product that perform in similar ways, which I think might have given people an understanding of why are so many buildings impacted now if they hear that part of the story. So I have a question that John Joyce put in, which kind of relates to this bit. I don't know if John's on and if he wants to ask about Stay Put, or whether he would like to. So if he is, unmute and say it. If he's not, I'll read the question out.
Yes, Matt, I'm on call. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. It was the one about Stay Put.
Yeah, I'm a building services consultant, and I've had major concerns with the Stay Put policy throughout my professional life. And it was really, and when I've done seminars as well, and hosted how many people believe in the Stay Put policy, without categorical, every member of the audience has no faith in it. So it was really just to raise the awareness about the Stay Put, and it's still there, it's still legislative. And it's, as Peter Rapps put, I think he hasn't dismissed it, but Peter says, what's the plan B? And that's where I'm coming from at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's, to me, when people ask me about Stay Put, I sort of try and answer it and explain what it is and and then sort of trying to explain to people. For example, one of the common ones I find is people say, well, why don't these buildings have fire alarms in them? And then you get into a discussion around different types of fire alarm and what the assumptions are. But ultimately for me, and I take everyone's view on it, it works in theory in most cases if you know, compartmentation holds up, people don't leave a door propped open, you know, there's so many layers of potential failure that, to your point, I think when that goes wrong, why isn't there a way of flicking a switch and getting everyone out, you know, and telling everyone to leave? You know, that kind of, in theory, what it seems like we overly rely on stay put. But undoing that now and moving to a different strategy would have significant cost and operational implications, I guess, and design implications, which would I guess the question back would it be feasible to undo stay put now over hundreds of thousands of buildings? How would we do that without creating another crisis? I think so. I'm not defending it, but I just sort of try to look at it in the round and say, how do we get from where we are now to where we might like to be?
Yeah, I think it's a fair comment. I don't have the solution, because everything always comes down to cost, and to that whatever solution we provide, and the majority of the views and the building work I'm involved with is new build, and you know, the existing build analogy of a fire now next door to your apartment, next door to your daughter or son's apartment. Are you going to stay put in that current regime? And I think a lot of people will not do that. So the fire service have to take a really, you know, in my view, a technical solution now. Even if we've got social tower housing where there's a stay put policy in place, is to negate that decision and get people moving out of that building as quickly as possible. Yeah, and I think that's where the fire service has moved to, really, you know, in operational response. But yes, I think there's some points being made actually on this, that around good communication and some mentions of Elspeth and stuff, but effectively a number of the residents did say, oh, you know, I received what I think it was Ed Defan said, I got a WhatsApp message from a neighbour or whatever to say, get out, because they were watching. And so there are those informal methods of communication, but, you know, being able to hit the big red button that tells everybody to get out, it seems to me sensible on one hand, and I think it's definitely a discussion that we need to have. And I think there's a ton of comments that have come in. I think so. Elspeth, because Elspeth was mentioned, and Elspeth is highly active in this whole world of evacuation and PEEPs, etc. And I'm sorry if I've misdescribed you, Elspeth, maybe come on. But she said the biggest sadness for me is that Professor Purser told the Grenfell Tower inquiry that every non-disabled person could have evacuated the building in 7 minutes if they hadn't been told to stay put. I've yet to find a prior professional who's willing to say that they would stay put once they knew there was a fire in a building they were in. I think that's a really good point, and we're still telling everybody that this is a stay put strategy. Don't worry, you'll be fine. In theory, you could stay asleep while next door burns and you'll be okay because the fire service is going to get there, etc., etc. Which is great until it doesn't. And you know, obviously, external walls are one mechanism for that being undermined, but we're still not taking internal compartmentation seriously. So my question always to clients is, well, okay, this is, it's designed for 120 minutes between floors, or it's designed for 90 minutes between flats, or whatever it is. How do you know? And the regulator are actually now starting to insist or strongly suggest that, for example, if you say 120 minutes between floors, that you go and get cover meter surveys to check the depth of concrete cover on reinforcement, etc., to actually prove, as far as you possibly can, that that building was built in accordance with its design and will perform. So a long way to go on that one, I think. Jay's promoting his podcast. Great, Jay, well done. Fire Ninja podcast, always worth a listen. But Phase 1 report discusses the advice residents were given.
and you turn the inquiry report into an audio book. That's great. Cost is a factor in addition to, yeah, absolutely is a cost. These changes always come with costs attached, and then you get into the discussion of who pays. In the PBSA company I work with, we engineered out stay put. Oh, interesting. With AOV assessments and fire stopping works, one measure. Right, okay. Lots of time and effort goes in not educating our customers, it's not always effective. It's an interesting point. I mean, human behaviour is a really important one, and you know, people like Professor Ed Galia from Greenwich is absolutely doing amazing work in that area. Manchester last Monday, Hotspur Press building, smoke spread the air system was operated. Unfortunately, not everyone evacuating. Right, okay, so I'm assuming that, yeah, so this was in a, Merlin, perhaps you could, are you talking here about the blocks that were adjacent to the, I thought the Hotspur Press building was vacant. So are we talking about a building proximate to that?
It's the building adjacent to it.
Ah, right, yeah, okay. So the simultaneous evacuation system didn't work. Well, that's, let's hope they're investigating that, because that's not good. It's important to remember that so many people watched the documentary hadn't thought about Grenfell at all for years and didn't know any of the detail at all. So for them, content of the documentary may have been similar to that Mr. Bates versus the Post Office had for us. In that way, it did a good job of introducing some of that. You're stealing my thunder, Sue. We haven't communicated on this. I was going to come on to Mr. Bates in a minute. So, yeah, great. Okay, so conscious of time, and I've got 2 minutes. I've massively overrun, so apologies, everybody. Storytelling. I think the timeline, the cutting back to the phone footage all the way through, I thought was really powerful, and I found that quite disturbing, and just showing you in real time where that flame had moved to over that relatively short period of time, or ridiculously short period of time. The human stories, I think they gave lots of time to those main characters telling their stories, and I think that really humanized the whole thing. And I think it was described by one critic as rage-inducing, the whole documentary. It did point to policy failure. We haven't really had time to talk about it, but Lakanal and the lack of change post Lakanal 16 years ago, emergency planning failures, crisis response failures, failures of leadership across the piece. Just failure after failure, and I think that's been identified in the inquiry. Justice, the lack of it. I thought it was really powerful in the final credits with PTAPs calling out the names of the, let's just call them villains, and interspersed with the victim stories as well. I thought was a really powerful ending to the documentary. So you're correct, totally avoidable. And the last point I just want to mention on the impact, and apologies, we are out of time, but I've just asked the question, will this documentary actually make a difference? And my thought, regretfully, is no. I don't think it's cut through in the way that the Post Office, Mr. Bates' dramatisation did. And the way, my measure for that is, has it been mentioned in Parliament? Has anybody quoted this documentary in Parliament since it came out? And I can't find anything on Hansard. And unless the policymakers keep this at the top of their mind, I don't think we're going to get the change that we want to see. So it leaves me with the final question. Again, I hate to say it, but, is society, our policymakers, bored of Grenfell? Do they just want this to go away and pretend it never happened? Or are we actually going to properly change and take it seriously? So again, we haven't got enough time to discuss that, but it would be good to carry on the conversation afterwards and leave comments, email me, whatever, and I'll try and get some summary of comments out. But so that key question at the end, is society bored of Grenfell? I think is something that we need to be honest about, and we need to say that, we're all very interested and we want to do something about it, but do we have colleagues, friends and peers and policymakers around us that have a similar amount of passion about solving this problem? So I think on that one, I would like to thank everybody. Apologies, I didn't know how long this was going to take, so we've kind of overrun. There are some other questions as well. I will write back to everybody that submitted other questions. And please feel free. So yeah, Abdul, doc in a post-Grenfell world needed. I absolutely agree. And I think if anybody can raise that with the production company, raise it with Netflix, raise it with anybody else, this story needs to be told and we need to keep telling it. I think would be my final parting shot. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for coming.